order to address many of the policy issues, you will need technology. To take an example, the planning of space, planning of the ocean space, it is increasingly busy. We heard this morning, out of sight, out of mind. Thanks to technology, there is less and less activity that is out of sight. And not only that, but you can monitor it in real time. Polluters, whatever, thanks to satellites, thanks to all sorts of drones and the like, you can monitor that. So technology is key for sort of addressing the policy question. It needs to be taken on board. We are working on that, notably on economic models for implementing the technology. That can be often an issue. Second aspect, international cooperation. Of course, in the oceans there are global public goods. There is nothing new about that. And international cooperation is definitely needed if you want to develop the technologies that will make the exploitation of oceans sustainable. We had the example of plastics that was discussed this morning and at a parallel session yesterday. Clearly, the technologies to recycle all these plastics, to clean the oceans and so on, this is something that is at stake for the entire world, for all countries. So international cooperation in research is definitely needed. We are working on that in DSTI, and we are seeing that countries, well, they enter into international cooperation when they see a clear benefit for themselves. So in cases where there is a win-win situation, they will do it. If you mention just global public goods, whatever, the reaction would be the same as you were mentioning about ministers in charge of tourism. They won't pay that much attention. So an effort needs to be done there by really countries being aware that international cooperation, notably in research, is definitely needed for developing the technologies that will allow this sustainable exploitation. Third thing, at national level, there is a need for policies at national level for doing that. Governments should not only sort of look for an excuse at international level. You know, it's an international public good. What can I do on myself and so on? No, that does not work. First, we heard this morning about the necessity to address plastics early in the process at national level, at the source of pollution, not only cleaning, but ensuring that there is nothing to clean at the end. And when it comes to research policies at national level, we are working on that. Our Ocean Economic Group is working on that and looking notably at the complexification of research processes. It's rarely now a single company or a single university, even the two working together, which can develop new technology. It is ecosystems with a variety of actors, small and large firms, universities, public research centers, all sorts of intermediaries with a mixed status. You have venture capitalists and so on. And developing a policy in this context is first much more effective. And second, it's also more difficult in the design. So as we have interest in gaps in our knowledge, that's one that we've identified and that we are working on. And last but not least, we are OECD, so we want numbers. Our Ocean Economy in 2030 report took stock of existing statistics, but it also shown that these statistics are really poor. We need to improve our knowledge of the oceans. We need to improve the data that we are collecting, but also the processing that we have of this data. Valuation techniques need to be developed.
The 2 days of discussion have showed how better protecting the ocean and its ecosystem is important and challenging, and pointed to the need for much better monitoring of the way human activities are impacting the oceans. They also pointed to the potential for scientific and technological advances, but with the caveats that just in the last few minutes we have heard, and in the last section, that cannot be everything, but it's a very important part of the solution. As I said at the outset, the OECD has a role to play here in accompanying countries in their efforts to protect marine ecosystems and resources, while maximising the socio-economic contribution of fisheries and aquaculture to coastal communities and societies at large. And we know, of course, that there are societies where that is really, really important, and we cannot ignore it as we think about the issues going forward. Sustainable management of fisheries is really challenging. How do you manage a resource that's on the move all the time and interconnected, and supporting communities in the way that I just described, so that we don't end up with creating inadvertently or in some way that was unintended incentives towards overexploitation, because that has been a little bit the history of the kinds of things that have happened. And in order to avoid that, we need to really understand the state of the resources and the socioeconomic dynamics of the sector and the coastal regions. For that, we need good monitoring systems. That requires sustained data collection, and that as well is difficult and very expensive to do. And with the prevalence of illegal fishing, that of course adds to the difficulty and can undermine the efforts of governments. And as I said, coastal communities are sometimes highly dependent on fishing and related activities, making reform socially and politically sensitive. Countries therefore need to be ready to share information that is really important to build knowledge on the status of resources and fisheries across frontiers, and also to learn from each other in terms of best practices. Now, I mentioned at the outset the Fisheries Committee, and it would be remiss of me if I didn't mention, at least very briefly, some of the very good work that that Fisheries Committee is doing. In November of this year, we will publish our review of fisheries. This is a publication which comes out every 2 years. It has a very wide country coverage. It used to restrict itself to describing production and trade and the policies for fisheries. This year we're adding information on some of the regulatory aspects, on the status of the fish stocks, and so we think the report will be even stronger this year than it has been in other years. One very important point in order to tackle the problematic subsidies that cause overfishing, and which will need to be done in order for us to achieve SDG 14. We need to know what it is we're talking about. So for years the Fisheries Committee has been collecting data on support to the fisheries sector, but in the last year or so, and for reasons which I think are obvious, we have really stepped up that effort. We now have data which will be online in the very near future, covering 38 countries, many of the OECD countries, and key emerging and developing countries. So this is really, really important as a first step in knowing if you don't know what kind of support governments are offering and what form that support takes, then of course you're not able to identify which are the most problematic kinds of subsidies, and neither will you be able to reform them effectively. We are also working on IUU fishing, and we're also working on political economy aspects. So that describes in a nutshell what the Fisheries Committee is doing.
Overall, my takeaways from this 2 days, or this 1.5 days, is really framed by the opening remarks from Ambassador Peter Thompson. His comment that we have to have urgency about this, we have to find a balance between production and protection. We cannot hide from the trade-offs, but we must also look for synergies and opportunities. And there is huge opportunities there, and also challenges. I think we have to look for incremental changes to policy, but also ways in which we can be transformational. It's not either or, it has to go together. One of the things that really struck me, and Carmel picked up on this in her remarks, was the sheer number of policy communities that we are trying to influence. And it reminded me of a major report that the OECD did a couple of years ago, some of you may be aware of it, called Aligning Policies for a Low Carbon Economy. And this was an across-the-house look at how you can get better alignment on those policies that are going to have an impact on our transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy that are outside the core climate policies. So the same thing has resonance here. I think the same thing applies. We have a set of core ocean policies which are going to be very central, very important, and we've touched on those today. Marine spatial planning, fisheries, things like that. But there's a whole lot of other policies and policy areas that are going to have an indirect impact that are often outside the purview of those ministries that have responsibility for oceans. Things like competition policy, trade policy, agricultural policy. So when you start thinking about things such as the land-ocean interface, there's no one ministry that looks after that. We have to have a joined-up approach. So one of the things I would like to push within the Environment Policy Committee and the OECD more generally is maybe we need a larger policy alignment for the ocean economy. And this would build on the work that DSTI has done on looking at the ocean economy to 2030. I think that kind of joined up thinking needs the forensic examination that the OECD can bring to this kind of exercise. And that was really driven home to me today. More pragmatically, that's kind of the big picture stuff. And more pragmatically, it's clear that we need to do more work on plastics, both in terms of the design, the disposal, the recycling, the transport. This is the key in terms of resource efficiency, the resource efficiency dimension that we really need to take a look at. And we are doing work on that, particularly in the area of microplastics. It's fairly scary when you start thinking about what we're eating in the fish that we eat, the persistence of these plastics and these microplastics in the environment highlights that we need to look at all the possible policy options for addressing that. The second area that we are planning to do work on, and this is before the policy committee, the Environment Policy Committee, is looking at policies to manage the risk of eutrophication in the coastal zone. So looking more closely at that land, coastal zone interface around nitrogen hotspots. How do we get policies to manage runoff and so on? And this leads us into the broader dimension of coastal zone management, where we could start a stocktake of current approaches. There is an OECD Council recommendation on coastal zone management that is some years old and could use another look at that and update it, building on the work that we've done in the intervening years. Someone has mentioned indicators. This is a core work for us in the Environment Directorate. We are really doing some quite groundbreaking work, we think, on using geospatial data and Earth observation data to get a much richer set of indicators that are spatially specific. They can be updated in real time at a lower cost, and trying to feed that into our broader indicators framework for green growth and well-being. Finally, I would point to the fact that we are launching a joint project with the World Bank and UNEP and the Global Green Growth Institute. Well, we have a joint project, sorry, the Green Growth Knowledge Platform. And we are launching next week a new program on natural capital, and some of our planned work on indicators and so on will be included in that program.